Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the Institute for Security and Development Policy. It is great to be with you today to speak about a subject that we have been working on for some time. As you know, the Institute has been working on Central Asian matters before its inception, really, if that is possible. And we are very happy to have been working, especially with the Embassy of Kazakhstan, on a number of projects over the past few years. Ambassador Yellokinov is here. We're very happy to see you. As you know, this year marks the 25th anniversary of the collapse of the USSR and of the independence of all the successor states. And we thought it would be an interesting idea in general to look at the question not only what has been achieved over the past 25 years, but what could the next 25 years look at. So we have several issues in this area. Johan, Engvall and I have been working on a regional project on pretty much the same issue, which has been in cooperation with the British government. In a few weeks or months, we will release, as part of our joint center with the Central Asia-Caucasus Institute in Washington, a book about 25 years of Western policy towards Central Asia and the Caucasus, which gives us an opportunity to look at achievements but also shortcomings in Western policy and ways to improve Western policy towards this large territory. And specifically today we have the release of a study which we have been working on, which was focused on a more specific issue, which was on Kazakhstan. As you see from the title, it's Kazakhstan 2041. We came up with this idea because, as you may know, in Kazakhstan, the Kazakhstani leadership has had an interest in future visions. President Nazarbayev first, I believe, launched a vision of Kazakhstan 2030. And then Kazakhstan 2050. We didn't feel we had quite the competence to look as far as 2050. But we thought that 25 years of independence, a quarter century, is an important milestone, and that gives us an opportunity to at least look what could things look like in the next 25 years. And Johan, who has been actually the main expert on Central Asia at our institute, has been doing a lot of the work, particularly on the internal issues in Kazakhstan. He will speak to those in a minute. I guess I should just say that when you try to look further than the immediate 5-year period, perhaps, things are, of course, by nature difficult to predict. Those of you who have worked with scenario planning know that. We have in the past worked, among other, with the Swedish defense establishment on a number of studies that have had a 20-year future perspective. It is very often a hit and miss operation, but it gives you an opportunity to look at some deeper underlying factors, which sometimes people in the think tank world that are focused on current news and the news cycle may not be so much focused on or interested in. And these involve, of course, longer term demographic trends, economic trends, which are really the main things that you can speak about with any type of certainty, but also ask some questions about what not only what is likely to happen within a country, but what could happen with the regional environment in which it finds itself. And obviously, as you know, in Kazakhstan's location, there are so many factors, so many big powers and smaller powers that could affect the future of the country, that we have a number of variables that makes it very difficult to say anything with certitude. But it's nevertheless, I think, an interesting exercise. So before I give you on the floor, I'd like to say just a few things about the past 25 years, because you can't really speak about the future without speaking about the past. And I think, in general, this is a good opportunity, this milestone, to look at what was achieved everywhere in this region and what it wasn't. And I think there is a general tendency, if you look at reports by Western government, particularly by Western non-government organizations, to focus on what has not been achieved. So much so that we sometimes focus on what actually has been achieved. And we have a tendency in general, I believe, at our institute, but particularly looking at these new countries that didn't exist on the world map 25 years ago, to consider the glass to be half full rather than half empty, and to view also both the achievements and shortcomings of countries in the context of where they started off 25 years ago. And I think this is why the case of Kazakhstan is quite interesting, because I would argue, Mr. Ambassador may disagree, that few countries were less prepared for independence and had less of a preparations, if you will, for independence. And few countries had more difficult conditions in which to build independence at the collapse of the Soviet Union than Kazakhstan did, for a number of reasons that we don't really have time to get into here. Some of them are in our study. Others have been extensively written about. Starting off, of course, with a demographic situation in which Kazakhstan was almost a bi-communal society. It was a society whose borders, of course, existed on paper, but not in reality. There were Soviet administrative borders. Energy links, road links, even not so long ago, if you were to drive from Tashkent to Samarkand, you actually had to pass through a little bit of Kazakh territory. Central Asia was full of these examples of little quirks in boundaries, in power distribution lines and gas lines that made it very difficult to turn what had been an administrative entity within the Soviet Union into a real independent state. And of course, as we know, President Nazarbayev of Kazakhstan was from the beginning, one of the leaders that tried to salvage as much as was possible of the integration of the good part, we should say, of the integration of the Soviet Union, and of course was very much upset with the Belaveja Accords, whose anniversary we're also commemorating, when the leaders of Belarus, Ukraine and Russia decided to abolish the Soviet Union without consulting any of the other leaders, and especially not consulting the leading advocate of reforming and maintaining some form of unit, which was the leader of Kazakhstan already then, Nursultan Nazarbayev. So from that background, I think that is from the starting point we should have as a reference point, and in which I think we can see that today Kazakhstan is not only, we can say, it successfully completed a transition to independence, but it also, in spite of having some of the greatest challenges, has also been able to achieve serious achievements in its state-building efforts. And I think this goes back to a general attitude. I think most of us who have worked with Kazakhstan, even compared to many of its neighbors, find that it has a very pragmatic and non-ideological approach to problem solving. And this has helped the country transition to a market economy, to a high level of political stability, and not least, as we related in publications released last year, a surprising level of international engagement, both with its neighbors and also in multinational fora. That has led to the country, of course, gaining for itself a seat in the United Nations Security Council for 2017 to 18 as the first country in Central Asia. Now, obviously, diversity has been one of the factors that was the most sensitive, given the large ethnic Russian population and their location in very heavily concentrated in certain localities. So on the one hand, Kazakhstan's leaders have faced a multi-ethnic population while also trying to build a cohesive national identity. This has meant that in language policy, among others, it has had to walk a very fine line between the use of Russian as a language of communication between all the ethnic groups of the country, while also gradually asserting the state language. We have seen, for example, the move of the capital from the southeastern corner of the country to the north in 1997 as one element of this policy, I would argue. And we have also seen that being a multi-ethnic and multi-confessional country, Kazakhstan has been facing, like all post-Soviet Muslim majority states, the issue of how to handle religion and the relationship of the state to religion. And what we see here, I think, is very important, given that the events happening elsewhere in the Muslim world, namely the strict adherence to a secular state, to secular laws, and to secular education. That not only Kazakhstan, but most of the countries of the region, from Azerbaijan in the west to Uzbekistan and even Tajikistan in the east, have all made this very clear choice for a secular form of government. This is not representative, if you will, of the rest of the Muslim world. That what we see from Turkey to even worse examples in the Middle East is that when you fail to uphold the separation of the state and religion, we end up, as in the case of Turkey, with two Islamic sects fighting with each other, and eventually end up in a coup d'etat that involves a bombing of the parliament with F-16 guns. That's not where in anybody's interest, and I think the secular model that's upheld by Kazakhstan and many of its neighbors is heavily underestimated and undervalued in the West. I'll say only a few things about economic and social issues. Kazakhstan was in a better place economically than many of its southern neighbors already at independence. It's been able to safeguard its position as a middle-income country, and among other by what the World Bank has termed very radical and state-of-the-art reforms in the area of social welfare, pension reforms, labor market reforms, that have made it, relatively speaking, the most market-oriented economy in the region. We have also seen, especially in the economic area, an economic model that has been largely dependent on extractive industries, oil, gas, and minerals, which has worked well for Kazakhstan when the prices of raw materials were high, particularly the oil price, and enabled what you see on this picture, the building of a new capital in Astana that Kazakhs are rightfully proud of. But I think many people now realize that we're entering an era where an economy built on oil is not going to be sustainable. The question, of course, is what do you actually do if you try to diversify? Many of the countries that are dependent on oil and gas have talked about diversification, have tried to embark on diversification, but they all find that it is very difficult because of what oil does to the rest of your economy, but also, especially in the case of Kazakhstan, because of the landlocked nature of the country, which of course was a serious issue even in negotiations with the WTO, because how do you compete even on agricultural products in the world market with the tax that is added to you by distance from any export market for your products. So this is, of course, something that the government now has doubled down on trying to work on diversification, and is, of course, way too early to speak of the results. In terms of political and state reforms, Kazakhstan has been explicit about a gradualist approach to reform. We continue to have a state that is strongly dominated by the office of the president. We have a resistance to the idea of decentralization of power. The mantra has been first economic reforms and only then political reforms. And therefore we have seen reforms that have improved state services and deliveries of services to the population. By contrast, it is not clear yet that these reforms have contributed to decentralization, let alone democratization of the political system. But I think it should be said that even the Kazakhstan 2050 vision notes that the only path forward to modernize the country and to make it competitive is political liberalization. So the challenge for the next 25 years is, in a very difficult regional environment, how do you engage? And especially if you don't have the luxury of high oil prices that you used to, how do you engage in simultaneous economic diversification and in political liberalization without having that affect the stability of the country, which, it should be noted, the private sector has noted as the most attractive feature of Kazakhstan as an investment target. Now, I won't go too much into foreign policy. I'll speak a bit more on the future indication in a moment. But I think the key thing which is reflected in the study we released about a year ago, called Asserting Statehood, about Kazakhstan's role in multilateral organizations. Kazakhstan's foreign policy has been based, of course, on a foreign policy of balance between, a positive balance between its major international interlocutors, not shying away from a close relationship with Russia, but seeking to balance that by equally positive relations with other powers, primarily China, other Western powers, and other Asian powers. What's happened, I think, in the past decade is, to a much greater extent than previously, we see really two powers being the dominant ones in the Central Asian context, that is Russia and China. Kazakhstan, to some extent, can use China to balance its relationship on Russia, and others collectively to balance the reliance that it has on those two. And it remains to be seen if the foreign powers, other than Russia and China, will be sufficient, if you will, to play that role of providing enough of a pluralistic international environment for Kazakhstan to continue to do this. As we'll see in a moment, there are many different things we can consider to make predictions about that, but I think before that we should look at the scenarios for Kazakhstan's domestic development. So Johan, I'll hand the floor to you.
Svante gave a good overview there of the background, so then I will turn immediately to the, I would say that in this presentation I will focus on three broad areas. And that's first the social structure, and here I will focus on a few, since we have not so much time. I will highlight a few major social factors such as demography, urbanization, and also Svante mentioned about this, but I will talk a little bit also about this value of secularism and the issue of religion or religious aspects. And then I will talk about the economy, and here I will mainly focus on what I see as what we saw as some of the most important aspects of the economic development, and that's mainly the need for two transformations, continuing transformations, maybe we should say, in the sphere of economic structure, that is more diversifying the economy, but also the issue of economic management, the transformation in that sphere. And I will also talk a bit about agriculture, as well as the issue of continental trade and the opportunities and challenges for Kazakhstan to emerge as a hub here for a international or this Eurasian economic sphere. And then finally I will talk about the governance factor, and the focus there will be on the need for improving public administration and also institutional reforms, including also controlling corruption as major issues that needs to be addressed in the future, and which has also been prioritized in the long-term vision by the Kazakhstani government. But if we start a little bit with the demographic aspect here and the evolving social structure, of course, one thing is that even if Kazakhstan is as large as the entirety of Western Europe, the population is not a bit more than 70 million. But the population, as Svante said, is very diverse and multi-ethnic, and also historically the territory here of Kazakhstan has been really a meeting place of various cultures and religions. But one aspect here is in the coming 25 years that we look at, that we think is of course that Kazakhstan's population is projected to grow. You can see on this, there's a projection here of 2016 here and 2041, and we can see that first of all that it's projected to grow by about 20% there, from about 17 million today to more than 21 million in 2041. But as you can also see from these pyramids here, that the population will be aging somewhat, and that will also not intensify so much in the nearest time, but will definitely start after 2030 and then intensify further after 2041. So there will be an aging population here, which means that the ratio of the population that are dependent on those working will increase here, probably even double. So this type of demographic prediction will have the number of consequences. For example, then that the further economic development in this will require that the productivity of the economy is improved. Something that requires the application of new technology, improved administration, and further improvements to business climate and other things. So the need to get more out of the economy to sustain this more aging population. Let me go back. Yeah, and then another factor here that sustained economic growth will further then accelerate urbanization. It's right now the percentage is about 50 to 55%, somewhere there, that among the population live in urban areas as of now, and that is likely to grow to at least 70% by 2041. And at the same time, if economic growth continues, then of course Kazakhstan is likely also to continue to be a main target for migration, especially from the southern countries, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, and of course in this with the growing urbanization, then of course government policies we need to prevent the emergence of very chaotic type of settlements and random settlements, and that can have negative impact on social stability and labor market, environment, and other things. So this aspect of urban policy is a key area. The third aspect that we single out here also is this issue for a diverse society like Kazakhstan, and especially aspiring to become among the at least among the top 30 developed countries in the world. And Svante indicated this. There is really no alternative to protecting a secular state here, secular laws, secular courts, and secular education. And of course, the challenge here is also to combine this secularism with tolerance and respect for all religions here, and also ensuring popular support for this secular governance. And there we can look, for instance, you see this is not a very good picture, but you can still see this is from a research center that maps different religions or support for, and in this particular survey they asked the support for Sharia law, percent of Muslims who favor making Sharia the official law in the country. And there we can see all the Muslims, and we see the Kazakhstan here together with Azerbaijan. 10% supports that in Kazakhstan and 8% elsewhere. These are the two lowest. But you see that the lowest support here is in Central Asia. While you see in all the other regions, basically, there's no one below 50% support. So this is of course something that is very significant and as an important aspect here. And as Svante mentioned about this, especially against the backdrop of events that we see in the Middle East, there's a case to be made here that Western powers also should value this secular model here, and also support here to help develop and adapt this model, and also not to further strengthen this aspect. And then we don't see this risk very much. We believe that it's a kind of Islamic radicalization, so we see there's a very little support for that in Kazakhstan, so this is really something to build on. And then, of course, also there are several global processes also that are very likely to shape Kazakhstan's future here. and one of them is the rapidly developing access to information here. And citizens' ability to utilize this, or take advantage of these increasingly diverse and sophisticated information systems will depend quite a lot on the fuller integration here with the broader world when it comes to information access. If you take, for instance, Svante mentioned and talk about the multi-vector foreign policy that has been one of the trademarks of Kazakhstan. We believe here, especially that something like that should also be applied to the information sphere. So unlike its foreign relations, when it comes to the information sphere, Kazakhstan remains rather isolated with Russia as the main almost sole external source of information for the average citizens. So for Kazakhstan to have broader access for citizens to broader span of information, we believe that the multi-vector approach here is a possibility and an area where Western governments also have not really paid so much attention to, but it could be very much could be done here in order to link Kazakhstan and also the rest of the region to the wider world. If we turn to the economy, the long-term economic development will require a transformation of Kazakhstan's economic structure, but also the economic management of the country. Kazakhstan has, as you can see recently, exhibited some vulnerabilities now to negative developments in the world economy, and the near future at least is likely to be challenging. You can also say that Kazakhstan has chosen, in a way, an economic model of state-led capitalism in some strategic sectors, which means that there's a strong connection or a concentration of state ownership, state regulation and control in these strategic sectors, in energy particularly. While on the other hand, but that is just one part of the economy. The other part, you can say, the service economy, service sector, is much more dominated by more market-driven practices, and in these sectors we also see much less, some different, taxation regimes and things like that. But as we see it, the key challenge probably going forward will be to delimit the role of the state in order not to stifle private sector growth, to strike a balance here. If you look, for instance, at Russia, we see now that compared to 10 years ago, state sector share of the economy there was 35%, now it's up to 70%. So this is perhaps the major change in Russia, if you see in the economy. It's not to the same extent in Kazakhstan, but this is one aspect. And also, of course, because world demand for oil may decline, for example, possibly due to technological innovations and other things. There must be an ability here to react proactively to a potential shift here in demand away from oil. So a proactive stance here could be determine the country's economic future. And the government here has announced strongly that green energy is a future priority. That's also a key theme of the Expo 2017 that is coming up in Astana. And the country also has quite a strong basis when it comes to solar energy and wind power, but these sectors remain undeveloped. And another key area here, of course, is which we think is worth talking a bit extra about is agriculture, where Kazakhstan has great potential, not least basically becoming perhaps the breadbasket here of Eurasia. But to do so, the agricultural sector needs a radical overhaul, especially if you to implement these needed reforms. One aspect that might be needed here is that to create a single agricultural training and research center that can really function as the nation's lead institution here in transforming the agriculture. So one key institution here to really make this concrete, the policies here. While there are lots of talks, it still remains to be more concrete here and develop a strong basis for innovation and modernization. Another thing here is that the problems with reforms in land tenure is something that needs to be addressed also. We also have this issue of water shortages, of course, which is a key problem that goes in. The water issue goes into many aspects, and that's truly a regional issue, and we talk more about that in the report here. But when it comes to agriculture, of course, the lack of water gives less incentives to develop the agricultural sector, of course. But that the water issue is truly a regional issue here that requires broad regional agreements. But also in the agriculture, Western governments and firms can play a key supporting role here. And then we have the opportunities. One thing that needs to come about, if you think about that, Svante mentioned about that oil will not be the main. If we think 25 years from now, that needs to be complemented with a modern industry and a modern service economy, and some new opportunities for the development of the truly modern service economy may arise from Kazakhstan's location. As we can, it's not such a good map, but we can still see here Kazakhstan is Central Asian region here, and we have Iran and the Middle East. That direction we have Pakistan and India here. We have China, Russia, and the EU, Europe, of course. And here, so Kazakhstan's location here is a hub here of an enormous Eurasian continental economic space. Is something that is interesting in the future. In the short term, this aspect is mainly due to have been about complementing the trade northwards, the old Soviet, the links within the former Soviet system, with stronger links than primarily to East Asia, Europe, but also a little bit to the Middle East. But if you think about it in a longer term, all the way up to 2041 and beyond, we also need to consider the Indian subcontinent here, which will have a population that will be larger and also quite a lot younger than China's by 2041, and this is likely to be just as an important trade partner to Kazakhstan, and that is this aspect of the Indian subcontinent here is not so much noticed in Kazakhstan today, but that we believe holds a great promise. But to realize the emergence of Kazakhstan and also the rest of the Central Asian region as this type of land bridge here, since this is a landlocked region connecting both China and India with Europe, Kazakhstan should, in this sense, continue to work to improve relations, first of all, within Central Asia itself, which is key here to really make this region remove a lot of barriers and these problems when it comes to trade. Another aspect is that both from Kazakhstan side, but also with many other, China also. There's a lot of focus in all this about government initiatives, and primarily this hard infrastructure, and a lot of roads are being built and all that. But on the other hand, the governmental policy in Astana should encourage much more of private initiatives in all these areas when it comes to developing in the future this soft infrastructure rather than this just the roads and these things that makes this trade possible here, including everything from logistics to warehousing and financial services and other things. When it comes to trade across this territory. And finally then, when it comes to the political system, one aspect is, I mean, in the West there's been a lot of, already from the early 1990s, the assumption was very much that the process of this transition, or this transition paradigm that determined much of how we perceive how these countries developed, should develop after the fall of the Soviet Union. A lot of focus was then on that, the idea that the development of electoral processes could easily be developed, and that this was mainly to this aspect of transforming from authoritarian Soviet system to democratic systems. But this has proven to be quite simplistic, and over time, and especially now, it's been rather clear that this one-dimensional focus on the authoritarianism versus the democracy is an inadequate perspective. And then also in the past decade, you can say, or a lot of attention in development research have begun to shift towards a lot of focus on good governance and state effectiveness. And these factors have become appreciated more and more as prerequisites for also development of governmental openness and the creation of any functioning electoral democracy. But in order to be able, when it comes to Kazakhstan, in order to be able to respond to these increasingly complicated tasks that you likely will see in the future, this establishment of responsive and effective governmental agencies in all areas, especially those directly affecting the lives of citizens, will be of central importance here. And although Kazakhstan's institutional performance when it comes to governance have improved along several dimensions since independence, it is still striking that this governance deficit remains probably in a comparative perspective where Kazakhstan has the most room for improvement to do here. Especially when you consider the benchmark countries that Kazakhstan wants to join, and also what President Nazarbayev set out in his 2050 strategy, this aspect of developing a new, modern, professional bureaucracy, local governance that are more responsive, and these aspects are at the core of this. We can just show here then from this worldwide, the World Bank has a research institute which focus on this. Every year they report on worldwide governance indicators along six different indicators. And here we can see Kazakhstan in comparison with upper middle income countries. First we have control of corruption, for instance, up here, where we have Kazakhstan at the top here. And the ranking here is from 0 to 100, and 100, the higher the better. So we can see Kazakhstan very low on this control of corruption aspect. If you compare to upper middle income countries, it's more on closer to low income countries in that sense. And when it comes to these countries that they want to join, OECD high-income countries. You see there's a far to go there. But you see that in Kazakhstan's best rankings is when it comes to political stability here, and also although that has declined a little bit in recent years, but also when it comes to regulatory quality and rule of law to some extent. While the worst in a comparative perspective, relatively speaking, comes to ranking is on the indicators of control of corruption and voice and accountability. And so, if you, in light of this, as we said, these benchmark goals that are set in the Kazakhstan 2050 strategy, Kazakhstan should redouble here its efforts to overcome this governance deficit and focus on establishing these responsive and effective governmental agencies. And as part of the improving the quality of governance, as I indicated from the figure there, the aspect of reduction of corruption must stand at the top of the agenda here. And this is, especially if you think about it, that Kazakhstan's low ranking there, and also that it's significantly below this type of model states that Kazakhstan otherwise remains or follow quite closely, like South Korea and Malaysia, which are partly models here for Kazakhstan's Asian path of development here. Of course, fighting corruption is no small task. You know, a few countries in the last decades actually have really made any significant breakthroughs in this area. But those success stories that existed still indicates that this is about something more fundamental than just technical changes in legislation or and laws. But it really needs to be a transformation of the very idea of how citizens and public officials interact with each other. An important aspect of this, of course, is cutting back these physical encounters between state and citizens. So something here that modern technologies, and especially different forms of technologies in e-government, I think will be very useful in this sense. But overall, when it comes to governance here, we believe that Western governments and organizations could really pursue a fruitful cooperation here with Kazakhstan, especially then in improving governance and fighting corruption. But the thing is, and maybe Svante will talk a little bit about this in the end here, this aspect that you're writing the book about, with problem with much of Western interaction here, or donors or governments often choose to, that they need to choose to work with the Kazakhstan government here rather than against it or on it in a way that you know has very often been the case, unfortunately. So by really cooperating with government institutions and being a true partner here, rather than some kind of lecturer in these efforts to implement reforms, I think this a lot could be done here in these areas that really also serves as very important building block for democratic development and more open and transparent government.
So I'll try to wrap this up by saying a few words on the future of the regional environment of Kazakhstan. I would like us to have a lot of time for discussion. We have in the room not only the former but the current ambassador of Sweden to Kazakhstan, a former ambassador to the other countries of Central Asia, and many other valuable members of our community here in Stockholm. So I will be very brief. We identify in the study both global and regional factors that will determine the ability of Kazakhstan to continue to follow this balanced foreign policy that it has, if you will, been the model of for all the countries of Central Asia. And if you look at the multitude of factors, as I already mentioned, is such that it's very difficult with such a multivariate analysis to say something very, very decisive. However, even looking at the longer-term trend in many of Kazakhstan's neighbors, I think there is more reason for hope than if you look at the immediate situation today, which pretty much in most directions that you look is full of challenges more than opportunities. In starting with global factors, we identified three that are will determine many of the realities not only of Kazakhstan but every country in this region and further afield. And one is almost diffuse, it's the future of globalization, if you will. And we have Kazakhstan's first 25 years were a period of a rapid expansion of globalization. Now you can see, whether in the United States or in Europe or elsewhere, you see a backlash, if you will, against globalization, a strengthening of forces that want to return to the primacy of the nation state. And of course, particularly with the geographic location of Kazakhstan, if you will, the future of globalization as such will have a heavy impact on the ability of Kazakhstan to continue to develop its connections with countries further afield, as a country that has made it a strategy to engage heavily in the diplomatic area, in areas very far from its own borders in many cases. So that is one thing of which we can say very little. This debate is not going to go away, and that this will have implications. The second, I would say, is the trends in the Islamic world more broadly. Johan showed the figures of Kazakhstan's, and we know about Kazakhstan's, not only the states, but society's very significant commitment to secular government. This is the case everywhere, as we saw in Central Asia and Azerbaijan. The question is this a holdover from the atheism of the Soviet period? And will we, in 25 years, see a continued, if you will, situation where Kazakhstan and its neighbors continue to have radically different figures in terms of the attitude towards religion-state relationship than the rest of the Muslim world? Or are we likely to see a growing together, if you will, a return to the mean of the post-Soviet Muslim majority countries? Will they become more similar to the rest of the Muslim world in another way? This will have huge implications for Kazakhstan's current model of development. We can see, for example, that in a country like Kyrgyzstan, which ethnically, linguistically is very close to Kazakhstan, we already see a third of the population supportive of Sharia law. This is something that has happened in the past decade, which means we cannot take anything for granted in terms of what the current situation is. Obviously, what happens in Iraq and Syria and the, if you will, the mayhem caused by jihadi organizations actually plays both ways, if you will. In a certain sense, it strengthens the impetus for secularization, but it also means that we still have a very large global ideological struggle that has not been resolved. The final global factor, I think, clearly is the role of the United States and the posture of the United States to the world. It's less possible to say anything about this today than it was in the near past, obviously. And I think it's, but the question is, if you will, whether the past 8 years of America that has been retreating, particularly from Central Asia, but also from Europe and the Middle East more generally, is the new normal or if it is the exception. Will we see a reversion to the trends of the first 15 to 20 years of independence of Kazakhstan, of America that engaged strongly with the world? Or will we see a continuation of retrenchment? And I think the pendulum has swung very far in terms of retreat. It may swing a bit further, but our sense is that there are good enough reasons to believe that the United States will not isolate itself to the world, if nothing else, because it will find the cost of doing so much higher than engagement. But this is, of course, going to impact on Kazakhstan's entire regional situation. On the regional sense, we look at many of Kazakhstan's neighbors, and Johan already mentioned the neglect of the Indian subcontinent. I think in 25 years here, nobody can neglect the economic role of the Indian subcontinent. You may say, well, you have Afghanistan in the way, and Pakistan and India don't really like each other. On the other hand, looking 25 years from now, nobody, if you are sitting in Central Asia and planning your future, you cannot assume that these conflicts and these situations will remain the same. They have for a long time, but already you see informal trade in the dozens of billions between India and Pakistan. You see growing impetus, even compared to 10 years ago, for resolving these issues and from breaking out, if you will, to the north. Certainly Indian business has played a very important role here. And in that sense, I think this is something where Kazakhstan and the West actually have a very common interest in breaking up these choke points, if you will, to trade and cooperation. Of course, China and Russia remain the big issues, but I think if you look at the long-term trends, we find essentially that the short term is going to be the difficult term in both of these relationships, and then in the longer term, the situation shows more hope for promise. In China, you are likely, because of the Silk Road economic belt, to see a growing Chinese role in security issues, if you will, a more assertive Chinese position both in Central Asia and in other regions nearby. But if you look on the middle term, we see a need for China, for pure demographic and economic reasons, to focus its energies on stabilizing as a middle-income country. This means that the inward-looking requirements for China's future are likely to be quite heavy. In Russia, even more so, we see trouble in the short term, certainly, with the assertive efforts of coercive reintegration, if you will, even of adaptation of ideas that were originally Kazakh ideas of integration, but with a distinctively more political slant than what the Kazakh leadership would have liked. I think it's fair to say. But we look at Russia and we find that in the recent past there has been a tendency, even away from the civic and secular nation of the Russian state, towards flirting with ethno-religious nationalism, as in the case of Novorossiya and the annexation of Crimea. But if you look at both the economic capabilities of the Russian state, that even more will need to diversify its economy in order to play the role on the global scene that it would like to. It cannot realistically do that on the basis of oil in the next 25 years as it has in the past 15 years. And more importantly, Russia's demographic situation. For a country that by 2041 will have seen the ethnic Russians being about to lose their dominant status in the population, and where very well a majority of the conscript age population may be Muslim, it will be impossible for that country to pursue an ethno-religious nationalist policy centered on the ethnic Russian population. Therefore, we see over time, in spite of the short-term problems and difficulties, more than a higher likelihood of Russia returning to being a more cooperative partner with countries in Central Asia, which not least have deep connections to the Muslim populations of Russia, and where we see that the ability, if you are able, so to speak, to get through the short to middle term, the possibilities are relatively good to find a modus vivendi with Russia to accept the independence, and that's what we're really talking about, to accept the independence of the countries of Central Asia, especially Kazakhstan, which is the only one sharing a border, a long border with Russia, and to find a more or less a relationship among equals in the longer term. Looking finally at, before we move to the regional partners, we don't see EU expansion into Central Asia as plausible in the next 25 years. That should not come as a surprise to anybody, since now countries appear to be leaving the EU rather than joining the EU. But nevertheless, what we see is that the EU absorption of the Western Balkans remains very likely over a 25-year period. They are encircled by the EU. We view it as possible, maybe not likely, that some of the Eastern Partnership countries will be able to deeper their integration, maybe up to membership. We don't see this reaching across the Caspian Sea. However, what I think is fully plausible, if not necessarily likely, is that if Kazakhstan should choose and be interested in an arrangement comparable to the Eastern Partnership model, that should not be excluded. If Kazakhstan decides to embark on a policy that would mean an unilateral adaptation to the EU acquis communautaire to obtain a deep and comprehensive free trade agreement with the EU, this is not something that we view as entirely out of the realm of the plausible in the next 25 years. We're just throwing this out as a possibility, in the sense that you would actually have the extension of the EU free trade zone all the way to the Chinese border, if you have an implementation of these mechanisms all over the Eastern Partnership and then extended over the Caspian. However, we end on, I think, saying that the relationships within Central Asia are going to be crucial, particularly because of the continued likelihood of a domination of two external powers, Russia and China, with very complex, some positive, some negative elements in their relationship. The relationship, how Central Asian states themselves interact with one another, will be crucial. In the South Caucasus, of course, because of conflicts, there is no common voice. Armenia and Azerbaijan can never speak with one common voice versus anybody. But in Central Asia, there are no such problems of that magnitude. Even the Uzbekistan-Tajikistan divide, if you've seen President Rahmon's behavior recently in his travel to Tashkent during the illness and death of President Karimov, suggests that this is solvable in a completely different way than what you have in the Caucasus. And therefore, that to the extent that Central Asian countries are able to speak with one voice and to coordinate their own policies among each other, the region's ability to handle the role of very large surrounding powers will be that much more significant. Here, we look primarily at Kazakhstan's relationship with Uzbekistan as the key issue. There is an old saw, if you will, that these are the rivalries supposedly between Uzbekistan and Kazakhstan. I think over the past 5 to 10 years, we have seen, of course, continued centrifugal tendencies in the region, but we've also seen centripetal tendencies in Central Asia, not least in the energy field and in the ability of Kazakh, Turkmen, and Uzbek leaders to agree with one another on important infrastructural projects such as gas exportation to China. I think we've seen actually a document of strategic partnership between Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan. There is much content to be filled into this. But obviously, if the two large countries of Central Asia, Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan, can find a way to coordinate on foreign and regional affairs, this will make it very difficult for any foreign power, even large powers like Russia and China, to impose their own will on the Central Asian states. And moreover, if the two large states of the region coordinate, it will be very difficult to see that the smaller countries of Central Asia would not eventually become part of such an informal or formalized arrangement. And in that sense, I would say, while we look at 25 years in this study, we should note that already in the past months, with the transfer of power in Tashkent, we see a different attitude coming from Uzbekistan on regional matters. Mr. Karimov had a tendency to see the world as a glass half full. There are indications that his successor, in spite of much media arguments that he was probably even much worse than Karimov, seems to be seeing the world as more full of opportunities and full of threats. We'll have to see where this goes, but I think there are reasons to expect that in Central Asia a lot could change in terms of how countries that obviously in their initial period of independence were focusing on securing their own sovereignty, may be, especially in a challenging regional environment, focusing on how to cooperate. Ambassador Pettersson.
Yes, okay, I will start since I'm not connected to Kazakhstan, but I was the ambassador of Sweden in the other 4 Central Asian countries. So I just want to say that I appreciate very much your initiative on always keeping the importance of Central Asian states very high. And I think in case of Kazakhstan, you are starting in this way, and I think that is very important. And as we have discussed before, we have wanted to see something to happen in this region that would kind of solve and kind of make it a bit easier among these countries to kind of have a good cooperation between themselves. And I think with the demise of President Karimov obviously in Uzbekistan, I think that would be an opening, despite the loss for the Uzbekistani people, I would say, but certainly an opening also for the other countries in the region, and not least for Kazakhstan, whose ambitions somehow, I imagine, has been stifled, also have been stifled because of the position of Uzbekistan. And with that would come, as you said, Tajikistan and Kyrgyzstan and Turkmenistan at the end of this race somehow. So I agree very much with what you have said. I can see they go also for some of the other countries. I would like to see in the future at least some of these statistics also be presented in the case of Uzbekistan, to have a more reliable statistics, as you have on Kazakhstan already. And I think now perhaps at least we are hopeful and we think that it could be possible, it should not be excluded. We do not know what Mr. Mirziyoyev will have in his mind when he finally will be elected President of Uzbekistan on the 4th of December, as is presumed, but it will be good. When it comes to the secular policy, obviously, I have been, as you know, also one of the ones underlining the importance of this in this area for us and for our involvement in this area. It should be recognized that this is the case. We do not know exactly the situation in some of the other countries, but I think at least it should be addressed in a proper way and with respect to the policies of these countries. I also agree that in dealing with these countries we have to start respecting the independence and identity of these countries as independent countries. And we cannot lecture countries in the way that may have been perceived before. On China, just as a question also, I mean China and Russia and the competition there. China has been very heavily engaged in this area, but I wonder sometimes how China is perceived with this engagement also in Kazakhstan. We know from Kyrgyzstan, we know from Tajikistan, that the Chinese presence has not always been seen positively because of all the workforce being imported from China to make the infrastructure projects and so on. Otherwise, I would think, at least for Uzbekistan, that China was a positive model that Mr. Karimov at least thought he could copy, meaning he could have a very speedy development in his country, but still retaining a very strict dictatorship. There's a new book, by the way, in London called China, the Perfect Dictatorship, by the Norwegian Stein Ringen. And I think is elaborating on the model that China may have been in one way. And we are, many of us, in awe at how the Chinese have done it in the last years. I know for Uzbekistan that has been the case. I'm not sure how Kazakhstan had talked about it. Solar energy goes for Kazakhstan, is very necessary. It goes for the other countries. Recently I was in the US here last week, and I could hear from people working on energy questions that obviously there may be a game changer coming into this area when it comes to solar energy. The prices have gone down so enormously on that type of energy that whatever happens now in the immediate future, it will be oil, gas will not come back as it has been before. And that is something one should keep an eye on, as you indeed are doing here. Another question is actually, I appreciate your things on India, obviously, as a subcontinent. That certainly has been in my mind very long. Where is Mongolia in this? That is rather, it is a good example of a development that I think, at least for me, has been a very positive one, appreciative. We know that Mongolia has also kind of reached out its hand to the Central Asian republics, not least the Kyrgyz Republic, as countries that should work together in that region, because they are in a region, an environment that is not always so very conducive to the democratic ambitions of Mongolia, and with that could also come Kazakhstan. I will stop here, but just as a input at the beginning.
I'd like to take up some of those questions. I can take up first. The last aspect, Mongolia. It's a good case actually. I don't know exactly in Kazakhstan, but as you said with Kyrgyzstan, I remember when I was in Kyrgyzstan doing some work a couple of years ago. Their former then Prime Minister Uturbayev, he was very much inspired by when he was traveling around and trying to get some ideas for reforms, and then exactly the Mongolian experience with, of course, very similar also nomadic people, and also with the progress that Mongolia has made when it comes to especially business and also the governance issues that could be useful. The Chinese presence, China as a model, of course also China's, in Kazakhstan's case there's been a lot of focus also on these the Asian tigers, with Malaysia has been a strong also, and South Korea, and which have had this, but also China with this aspect of it, as I said, some kind of innovative state capitalism, that aspect which has been very significant in all these cases, with a strong state involvement in the, it's a market economy, no doubt about that, but the strong role of the state, both as an actor and as a regulator, and this aspect and also as setting out the strategies. So this aspect that is very much seen also in Kazakhstan.
And not least, if I may, the universities have in mind also, to allow the way of studies and bring the university research into that level, still retaining a very authoritarian system.
And then maybe, yes, but then of course you have this among ordinary citizens, of course. I often remember when I went to Karakol in Kyrgyzstan, in the border in China, and they stand and look through over the mountains and say, yes, there are 5 million and they are million, they come any day. Yes. So of course this historically rooted fear is still there in this region to some extent. Please.
Well, thank you very much. First, I would like to congratulate you on the selection of this bold topic, and given Kazakhstan's interest in 2050, this is a point well taken. But I think for you this is just the beginning. You have 14 other post-Soviet republics
Yes.
to keep you, so this will keep you busy until 2050.
That's the hope.
But the boldness of the enterprise is very, very encouraging, and I think that you have raised many salient issues and illustrated very, very many topical features. Speaking of the role models, I think that Oka has a good point in mentioning China. Obviously, there is an admiration in Kazakhstan for China, but China will never be embraced without reluctance, because there's sort of an ambivalent approach to China just because of its sheer size. And if Kyrgyzstan, is even smaller, and the fear of the Kyrgyz population is understandable, but Kazakhstan, with its the enormous territory, it has a big population, but in comparison to China, that's nothing. So of course there is an instinctive fear of China, whereas the other countries that are more on par, South Korea, point one taken, or Singapore, there is no reluctance there. They can more readily be portrayed as role models, and they are ahead in many areas. Education for one, economic development also. But speaking of economic development, of course, in the past decade or so, Kazakhstan has almost consistently been in the top whatever 10-15 countries. So it has been on par with those fast-growing economies in Asia. China, but also the United Arab Republics and so on. So it has singled itself out as one of the most successful in those terms. Turkey is a different issue, and with the recent development of tournaments in Turkey, and this brings out a new challenge, because with Turkey, Kazakhstan shares a common cultural heritage. It cooperates also in some of the current frameworks. The cultural community of Turkish-speaking languages. Also, interestingly, the Asian twin of the OSCE, the Conflict Living Framework in Asia, which recently, by the way, China has also embraced. For a long time, China had no interest in that, but now they have changed their thinking, and they have also now joined that community. But how do you see now the role of Turkey in relation to Kazakhstan, in relation to this the model, the political model, the religious model?
absolutely right that Turkey has changed. Turkey, in the early years after independence, was very much Western observers exaggerated the extent to which it was a model, perhaps, but still the notion of a state that is Western-oriented, secular state in a Muslim majority, and with some form of democratic institutions was more or less like an end goal for many, or a partial goal for many of these states. I think the problem is, there's a twofold problem. One is that the main problem, of course, is in the religious area, where Turkey is no longer a model. Turkey is a very different model now. It's a model of a country that maintains in name a secular constitution, but which has Islamized its education sector, and which is building an Islamic Directorate of Religious Affairs that is really in practice issuing fatwas and is really incompatible with the secular statehood. And of course a foreign policy that has been inspired by religious ideology and even sectarianism. And I think everywhere in Central Asia and the Caucasus there has been some fear and some, not shock perhaps, but dismay maybe is the best word, at the evolution of Turkey. At the same time, of course, that Turkey, if you will, in its political system has become a little bit more like Central Asia. In the sense that there's much more of a personal leadership by President Erdogan, very much disregarding formal institutions. You know, Turkey is still a parliamentary republic theoretically, but it doesn't behave like one. So that's kind of a wash, if you will. But I think in very few places in Central Asia do you see Turkey in terms of a model anymore. You see it as one among the many powers that you relate to. And I will note that, you know, buried in the news coverage was the role of President Nazarbayev in brokering the rapprochement between Turkey and Russia after the year-long conflict over the shoot-down of a Russian plane. And I think that suggests that countries in Central Asia, particularly Kazakhstan, maintain at the highest, Azerbaijan too, I would say, less so Uzbekistan and others, but they maintain a high-level engagement at the top with these countries, which comes from the fact that you have, in this case, 3-4 leaders that have been in power for a very long time and have developed relationships among each other that enable them to use these networks to engage in this type of diplomatic initiatives. Yes, sir. In the back.
My name is Svante. I'm an economist. I'm not a political scientist. Some of my comments are obviously going to be on the economic side. I appreciate the comprehensiveness of your presentation, and the downside of that is, of course, that you go very fast through a lot of very important issues. As an aside, I'm totally puzzled why the Kazakh government should take Korea and Singapore as role models, considering that Kazakhstan is a huge, densely populated, thinly populated country and has no infrastructure the likes of Singapore and Korea, but that's an aside. The two things that I would like you to spend a few more minutes on, and the first is that issue of landlockedness, because that's not going to go away. You can do anything you like in terms of politics, but I don't think that. So I think it'd be nice to hear what the government is thinking about how to not remedy, but how to cope with this issue when it comes to economic development. And the other thing is that you said that Mr. Engvall said that agriculture is obviously an option when it comes to alternatives for energy. And then he went very fast. He said that agriculture needed reform. There was a need for a single agricultural research center. There should be a reform in land tenure. There was water shortages, and there was a role for Western firms. Those are 5 dots that, for me, are not obviously related, but perhaps you could spend 1 minute to connect these dots and make it into a more easily understandable picture. Thank you.
The first aspect with about the landlockedness, of course, as you say. I mean, one, that's not, as you say, something that they can do much about. But I think that this kind of, when we talk about this as a trade, transport through this region, and as a land bridge in that sense, I think what we see here is some kind of the need for an open regionalism in this region here. That is, being open to the rest of the world. And because they are landlocked region, they cannot rely on the region cannot rely on its own internal markets, and not even the neighboring markets of Russia. So the one aspect that we focus on is this overcome this rivalries. Of course, it's important in the region to building mutual trust there and start with connectivity within the region and simplify. That is one thing that we focus on this regional aspect of that, and it's more like, and then one problem might be this aspect of what is Eurasian Economic Union, which way will that develop? Will it be more protectionistic, or will it allow this more open regionalism? I think is quite an important aspect for the future here. And agriculture.
Well, I think the starting point for the discussion on agriculture is that in the Kazakhstan 2050 strategy, it envisages the agricultural share of GDP to increase fivefold by 2050. Kazakhstan is already the 6th largest exporter of wheat in the world, and it has high quality wheat in its northern territories particularly. But we view that the ability, so there is a potential. The problem is, how do you realize this fivefold increase in agriculture by as a share of GDP? And we view that there are very serious challenges to this. The first is, I think, for the entire region, there is a very big issue of irrigation. Namely that we still are living with a Soviet investments, Khrushchev era even, in the Virgin Lands programs in irrigation that are extremely wasteful. Half of the water that is in irrigation leaks out. Whereas 1,000 years ago, as our chairman, Professor Starr, mentioned in his books Lost Enlightenment, he goes through how the complexity and the sophistication of the irrigation system that existed 1,000 years ago, including underwater canals, with extremely low rates of loss of water. To put it bluntly, irrigation in this region was much more sophisticated and effective 1,000 years ago than it is today. This is a regional problem. It's not that one country can fix. But if the Central Asian countries do not fix or have a major initiative, which is a very expensive one, on fundamentally transforming irrigation across the region, nothing like this is going to happen. But there are many other issues, like labor productivity is very low in the Kazakhstani agricultural sector, and if you look at the industrialized economies, France, the US, many others, you find that there's a lot in terms of production methods, logistics, the lack of storage infrastructure, and of course access to markets, which all require work for this notion of Kazakhstan becoming the breadbasket of Eurasia to be successful. On the flip side, if you look at population-wise, Kazakhstan, as mentioned here, is not going to have a major population growth. On the other hand, by 2041, Uzbekistan and Afghanistan will have serious population. We're talking about 50 million range, or in Afghanistan's case, probably higher. We have the figure somewhere in the paper about what the populations of these southern countries surrounding Kazakhstan will be. Given the rise of South Asia's population, Pakistan's rice production is not going to provide the food for these countries. Kazakhstan has a clear nearby market for its agricultural produce here if it manages to engage in these big transformations. And unlike oil, agriculture actually provides jobs for people. So that's the logic of our discussions. I think we have time only for one part, Mr. Ambassador, if you would like to... Yes?
That was just about to read.
I sensed it.
Okay, thank you. I also would like to congratulate your institute with the new publication, and of course our embassy is very much value cooperation with your institute, and of course I not in position to criticize or to analyze your new book. I think that it will be done by the participants of the forthcoming conference in Astana, where, as far as I know, your book will be presented. And so, thank you very much. And but I just recalled a new a saying, which is popular in our part of the world, that you cannot blame the mirror if for the image which you see, if you face lack of symmetry, so lacks, and though mirrors sometimes there are no perfect mirrors, because the right is left and left is right. But if it's symmetry, then it's okay. And I just also wanted to add a little bit to the answer of Johan regarding the why Singapore or other Southeast Asian countries are like a model for Kazakhstan. Indeed, Kazakhstan actually used the experience of some of the countries in that part of the world when we developed our strategy, including the strategy 2030, which Dr. Cornell mentioned. And since we have very not that much time, I just wanted to attract your attention to the fact that Kazakhstan recently opened with China so-called dry port. It is on the border between Kazakhstan and China, and it is developing very fast. It is not just, I hope that it will not be just the point of transfer, the just processing of shipments between China, Kazakhstan, and further to the Russia and Western Europe, but it also will be something like Singapore, actually. Well, there are could be some doubts, but still we invest very intensively to, Kazakhstan and China. And there will be new cities, and since it will be a kind of port on the economic Silkway belt area, so I think that there are bright prospects. Maybe you can one may perceive it as a plain propaganda, but it's actually our goal, and that's how we can answer to your question could be answered. I think if I took your question in the right way.
Just one comment, because it would get too long to get too deep into this. But again, being landlocked need not be hopeless. Just look at Switzerland. Just look at Luxembourg. So it has certain disadvantages, but it's not like it's the end of the world. I was just making the reference to Singapore and Korea because they are fundamentally very different countries. That's the whole point of it.
Well, that's a good point, of course. But we enter into a bilateral discussion. Though I just wanted to point that Kazakhstan is the world's largest landlocked country, actually, and Singapore and Luxembourg is
And Liechtenstein.
or Liechtenstein, right? And we it used to be considered as our disadvantage. But there are some disadvantages. Though we have Caspian Sea, the largest lake, 5 countries, and we are going to build the world's largest bridge, the country which will bridge other the neighboring regions, and given our rather big size, the area, so this bridge could influence more countries, involve more regions. So I think that I have to stop at this point because I can talk for hours. Okay.
Thank you, Ambassador. I think somehow the analogy came up in my head about Genghis Khan. And if you talk about Central Asia for long enough, you cannot avoid the subject. Genghis Khan. Genghis Khan, in fact, some experts have mentioned or termed what he did in turning the deserts into seas for all practical purposes, and using, of course, the horse-ridden cavalry of the Mongols into ships that sailed across these seas, where, of course, there was nothing to stop them, there was nothing in between, and they were able to cover large distances very quickly. Kazakhstan maybe could be a peaceful version of what Genghis Khan did in terms of, with the right infrastructure and with the right border systems and ports that you mentioned, dry ports, distance can be conquered. Just like if 800 years ago the Mongols conquered this enemy of distance, if you will, and turned it into their advantage, maybe Kazakhstan can too. But let's hope it happens in a different way.
Right.
With that, we are slightly over time. I'd like to close this event. I hope you will join us soon in the future for other discussions. We hope also that there will be other studies of other countries in 2041 or another critical year in the future. And we welcome you back. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.